So Pregabalin, as Sean mentioned, has misuse potential. The information sheet for Pregabalin that comes from the pharmaceutical company says that euphoric mood is a potential adverse effect of taking Pregabalin, and dependence on Pregabalin has been reported as a potential serious adverse effect. In addition, another potential, though rare, serious adverse event is an increased risk of suicidal ideation or suicidal behaviours or new or worsening depression. It has CNS, central nervous system, depressant effects, so it can depress the respiratory system, and it has the potential for additive effects on respiration when it's ingested with other sedatives such as alcohol or benzodiazepines or other opioids. As such, the consumer medication information suggests that doctors need to be advised of a history of depression or substance abuse, and to be alert for the potential for dependence or psychiatric side effects in people that they're prescribing Pregabalin to, and that they also need to take into account the other medication or the other substance use history of the person that is being prescribed Pregabalin. So as Sean said, it was first approved for medical use in 2004 and it came onto the market in 2005. And academic papers on misuse start appearing from about 2011 onwards. So I'm just going to briefly summarise these. They mainly were coming out of Europe. So in 2011, there were reports beginning online of recreational Pregabalin use in Europe. In 2014, Finland reported that they were seeing polydrug use deaths, particularly involving opioids and Pregabalin being taken together. In Ireland in 2017, they reported an increased prevalence of Pregabalin in intentional drug overdoses, so people intending to commit suicide. And also in 2017, there was a great systematic review done which found that there was a higher prevalence of misuse in those who use opioids or who have psychiatric comorbidity. So it's starting to build this picture of misuse and harms in a vulnerable population group. And all of this was occurring against a background of rapidly increasing prescribing and use. So in Australia, prescriptions began rapidly increasing from 2013. By 2015, as Sean said, it was one of the costliest drugs on the market. But as at the start of 2018, there were no studies in Australia on misuse or harms related to Pregabalin. So the big question was, is Australia seeing similar patterns of misuse and harms related to Pregabalin as had been seen internationally? And thankfully, late last year, two big studies came along, both of whom were led by women named Rose, only one of which was me. So I'm going to talk about the one that came out first. This is not my study. They pipped us to the post by about 2 months. It was very upsetting. So this is an excellent study led by Rose Cairns from New South Wales on rising Pregabalin use and misuse in Australia, and they looked at overdoses. Their study was set in New South Wales, and they used a sort of a multi-source approach. So they looked at prescribing data from the PBS 10% sample, they looked at Poison Information Centre relating to intentional exposure, so that is from New South Wales. They used data from toxicology units at 2 hospitals, and these were people who had intentionally taken Pregabalin, but that could have been because of deliberate self-poisoning or recreational use or misuse. And they also looked at the coronial database from 2005 to 2016 where Pregabalin was related. Though importantly, they highlight in their study that this was not toxicologically confirmed. They didn't actually have the toxicological testing in New South Wales for Pregabalin, so they were using free text reports and information on what the person was taking in the packets found at the scene. It wasn't actually from toxicological testing. And they aim to identify dispensing trends, to look at people at high risk of misuse, understand the demographics of intentional overdoses, and estimate trends in Pregabalin-related deaths. So as you can see, I don't have a laser pointer, so I'm pretending my finger is a laser, sorry. So as you can see, that there was a rapid increase in dispensing from 2013 onwards of Pregabalin, which is the blue line on both graphs. and also of intentional poisoning. So you can see a really steep blue line increasing from sort of late 2012, early 2013. Of the people, they used a method called latent class analysis to group people into risk of misuse. And what they found was that 14.7% of people who were prescribed pregabalin were considered high risk for misuse. That doesn't mean they were misusing, but they were high risk of misuse. So they were prescribed more pregabalin at higher strengths, they had many more prescribing doctors, and they were more likely to be co-prescribed opioids and benzodiazepines with their pregabalin. They were more likely to be younger and to be male than the general pregabalin using population, and they were also more likely to have concessional status. But this 14.7% of people that were considered to be at high risk of misuse received just over half of the amount of pregabalin prescribed per volume. So that's an awful lot of pregabalin going into a population, into a group of people who are at high risk of misuse. They then compared overdoses of pregabalin with two other gabapentinoids, or two other similar drugs, gabapentin and carbamazepine, and those who overdosed with pregabalin were more likely to co-ingest other sedatives, including opioids, benzodiazepines, other illicit drugs, and alcohol. 78% of the people who overdosed on pregabalin had actually been prescribed it themselves, so 22% were not prescribed it. It has been either they've taken someone else's or it's been diverted. And importantly, 64% of the people had a documented substance misuse history. And as I mentioned right back on the first slide, this is something that doctors should consider before prescribing pregabalin because of the risk of dependence. Compared to the overdoses, where the non-lethal overdoses, pregabalin-related deaths were more likely to be male, and again more likely to involve co-ingestion of other substances. 80% also included pharmaceutical opioids and 67% benzodiazepines. And the majority of these people were not in paid employment, again pointing to this vulnerable group experiencing harms, younger, male, concessional status. The majority of these deaths were coded as unintentional deaths, 66%, with just under 20% intentional overdoses and the remainder undetermined. So then a study that I'm a little bit more familiar with, having wrote it, so this again came out late in 2018. This was completed when I was employed by Monash University and working at Turning Point. So the study was set in Victoria. And it took data from the AMBO project, which is a database of ambulance attendances related to alcohol and illicit drug use and pharmaceutical misuse. And in this instance, pregabalin misuse was defined as someone who has taken more pregabalin than what they've been prescribed by quantity or frequency, that they've taken pregabalin prescribed to someone else, or it's been taken in combination with other substances that could contribute to the harms. And our aims were to compare trends in ambulance attendances relative to prescribing rates, look at the populations experiencing harm, assess the co-occurring other sedative use and also harms to self, so is this being misused in the context of self-harm, and also to compare the characteristics of attendances between those who misuse pregabalin by itself or with other sedatives, with or without other sedatives. So on this graph, prescriptions are in the red bars, so you can see them rapidly going up, and the blue line of attendances is ambulance attendances related to pregabalin is pretty much matching. It's very, very tightly correlated that as prescribing increased, that ambulance attendances increased also. That little dip in 2014, I didn't put the footnote on there, it was a data issue at the ambulance end. It's not a real dip, it's a the blue line dips because of a problem with data. It's not real. So over this period, over 6 years, there were just over 1,200 pregabalin-related ambulance attendances, and it was 50-50 male and female, and predominantly in middle age groups, 30 to 39 and 40 to 49. But importantly, just a touch under half of the people who were in an ambulance with pregabalin related to their harms had a high-risk history. Now this is either of depression, of self-harm, suicidal ideation, suicide attempt, or alcohol and other drug issues. Most commonly a history of depression or suicide attempt. Again, this is something that could and should have been taken into account when pregabalin was prescribed to these people. When we look at the co-occurring other sedative use, 66% were misusing pregabalin with another sedative. In this study, it was most commonly benzodiazepines, about 37%, followed by alcohol and followed by opioid analgesics. So really quite startlingly high rates of co-use. And about just under 40% of people who were misusing pregabalin were doing so in the context of a suicide attempt that led to them being in an ambulance. When we compared the group then between people who misused pregabalin with and without other sedatives, men were more likely than women to misuse pregabalin with other sedatives. When pregabalin was misused in that way, they were more likely to have a cognitive impairment, to have a Glasgow Coma score of less than 13. But there was no significant difference on the prevalence of self-harm or self-injurious behaviours based on the presence or absence of the other sedatives, which suggested to us that there's an increased medical risk when pregabalin is misused with other sedatives, but no difference in psychiatric risk. Overall, so we've now got two studies. They came out at effectively the same time. We didn't work with each other, the teams at all. We actually didn't know that each other's studies were coming out. One is based in New South Wales, one is based in Victoria. We're using completely different data sets, but they're saying the same things. So we're seeing a significant increase in pregabalin prescribing, but also misuse and harms. There are many high-risk users in Australia. The Ken study estimated that based on their predictions that there would be about 86,000 high-risk users of pregabalin in Australia. And that there's growing harms in vulnerable groups and people with low socioeconomic status. There's a really strong overlap with a substance use disorder history and a strong overlap with a high-risk psychiatric history. Which suggests that pregabalin is being prescribed to people where it could have been prescribed potentially with a little bit more caution had that history been known or been disclosed. And really extensive polysubstance use, particularly benzodiazepines, alcohol and opioid analgesics, and that increases the overdose risk because of the effects, the cumulative effects on respiration. And it was associated with both intentional and unintentional or accidental overdoses. So there's two kind of groups of harms being experienced. Of course, these studies have limitations. There's really limited data in Australia on where the medication was coming from. So in the New South Wales study, only one of their data sources was able to say was the person prescribed the pregabalin in their overdose or not. So they found 78% from one of their data sets. Couldn't tell that in the Victorian data set at all. And neither study was able to include private prescriptions or off-label indications. And so the condition for which pregabalin was prescribed was unknown. So we're sort of, we're putting everyone together, but we don't know if the harms are disproportionate into certain prescribing groups, but we can't tell that with the data that we've got. New South Wales coronial data did not have toxicological testing, neither did the Victorian ambulance data. It's based on self-report and data available at the scene and the paramedics' clinical observations and bystander accounts. They're really big population studies, which is great in some ways. It tells you, a lot about the harms in a big population, but what it doesn't tell you is what's happening in specific high-risk groups. And of course, neither study can discuss causality, just associated outcomes. So if a person has long-term chronic neuropathic pain, it is potentially, maybe they've got increased risk of depression or increased risk of suicidal behaviours because of that pain history. Does pregabalin have anything to do with that? We can't tease out causality using this data. Nevertheless, we think that there is sufficient evidence of harms to be able to start to make some recommendations. And so we've sort of grouped these into recommendations for regulators, recommendations for prescribing doctors, and for users of pregabalin. Firstly, pregabalin was recently rescheduled in both the US and the UK, and it would be, I think, valuable to look to the rescheduling and see if harms actually decrease, and to consider that in Australia. and also to consider whether or not Pregabalin should be included in SafeScript, the real-time prescription monitoring scheme in Victoria. Of course, that's not nationwide. For doctors, as we said, there need to be precautions taken when co-prescribing other sedatives, and to really have a good conversation with the patient about the risk when they're taking other sedatives as well. To undertake a risk assessment for misuse, and this of course means that a person would need to prescribe any substance use disorder history. Given the potential for harms, the Cairns study, I think, rightly recommended that doctors should avoid off-label prescribing for indications that don't have a strong evidence base, given the risk of harms. And the indications should be really carefully reviewed, including a person's psychiatric history. And for users, users of Pregabalin need to be aware that there is the potential for these adverse effects, including significant overdose risks when they're using it with other substances, and to disclose the relevant history to prescribing doctors. But all of these recommendations are predicated on the fact that a person is going to a doctor being prescribed Pregabalin. Now we haven't got a decent estimate in Victoria, but 22% in the New South Wales study would suggest that Pregabalin was not prescribed to that person. So where do those people get this information from about the risks of the drug that they are taking? Thank you, Sean, for dropping in this slide for me at the last minute. This was a lovely study that came out 2 days ago, and Sean brought me a slide so that I could talk about it, and I'm very grateful. So this came out in B&J Open 2 days ago, and it wasn't quite a longitudinal study, but patients acted as their own control. So they looked at people when they were taking Pregabalin and when they weren't taking Pregabalin. And there was a significant increase of suicide, of accidental overdose, of road traffic accidents and head injury when a person was taking Pregabalin compared to when they were not. And interestingly, many of these risks were more severe in a younger population group, which wasn't expected. And there were certainly higher hazards associated with Pregabalin than with gabapentin, which is of a similar family of drugs. So this is a great study and a great start to answering some of the outstanding questions. But because I am a scientist and I like questions just as much as I like answers, what I want to do is wrap up my part of the talk with what I think are the big questions that we're left with. One is that we don't have any good estimates of dependence in Australia. We can see that misuse is rising, we can see that harms are rising, but dependence, we don't have any data on that in Australia as yet. We also don't know what the primary motivations for misuse are. Now, so someone might be using Pregabalin or having been prescribed it and then take more of it because they like its effects. But there was also a lot of data coming out of particularly Ireland and the UK to say that people were recreationally using Pregabalin with other substances in order to enhance the effects of those substances. So taking Pregabalin with opioids and with benzodiazepines because it produces a particularly desirable euphoria. Is it because their pain is unmanageable, and so they're taking more and more of the drug that they've been prescribed because it's not working, and so the misuse is in the context of rising pain? Or are these people in psychological distress or feeling suicidal and are taking what is available to them? We don't really have that teased out well yet. Are there long-term outcomes from Pregabalin misuse? I don't know. We don't have data on that. Do trends and harms differ in high-risk populations? I think we potentially need to be concerned about people who inject drugs and some vulnerable populations and harms in those populations, and I think the next speaker is going to touch on that. And is information about the potential harms and risks getting through? Is it coming through from prescribing doctors to patients? If a person is taking diverted Pregabalin, where is this information coming from? Is it coming from anywhere? And how do we get information then to those who are misusing diverted Pregabalin? Thank you.